Hi, welcome everyone. Today we're talking to Kristin Leigh from the Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses. She's based in Australia, where racehorsing is still very popular, as it is in New Zealand, in the UK, the United States. I think I have all of them. I want to start off with you because racehorsing, like I said, I'm based in Holland. We don't have racehorsing here, but I'm going to start off with a picture. And if you could explain something more about racehorsing, what it actually entails, and when the competitions are, and the dangers for animals.
Sure. So, horse racing there's so many issues within horse racing that, you know, not so long ago, the general public, even here in Australia, where it's really popular, were really unaware of. Um, that photo, for example, is something called exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. So, what happens there is the horses have pushed so hard to run so fast to try to get over the finish line first that they will often, it's studies have shown 90% of the time will bleed from the lungs. Now, there's different levels as to how bad that can get. So they're graded from 0 to 4. So 0 is no blood in the lungs, and 4 would be what's happening in this photo here, where the horse is actually bleeding from the nostrils because the blood is so bad that's coming from the capillaries, the burst blood vessels in the lungs from being pushed so hard. So um, this is, even though 90% of horses suffer bleeding from the lungs, this is often not detected because it's deep in their lungs. So unless they have an endoscopy, no one would know. So it's only really known once it gets so bad that it's to a point where it can, lead to their death. And just last Sunday, for example, we saw 4 horses bleeding, having bleeds on the track that was so bad that they came through their nostrils. 2 actually died. And that was just in one racetrack on one day. So it's a really serious issue, and is just an example of how hard horses are pushed to win money for their owners. There's a load of other issues, obviously, within the racing industry that we'll get into, of course, but I guess the main ones would be what's called wastage. So it's when horses are no longer wanted and they're sent to the slaughterhouse or the knackery to be killed for pet food or for human consumption, where uh, we don't have a market for eating horse meat really in Australia, but in Europe and in Asia there certainly is. So we export a lot of young, healthy thoroughbreds after we kill them overseas to be eaten, and a lot of people are horrified when they learn that, because it's hidden by the industry. Um, so that's another really big issue.
And what is so horse racing? So how often does it happen? How long has it been around? Is it a cultural thing?
Horse racing's been in Australia for over 200 years, I believe, and I think it's I like to think it's had its peak and now that's on a downward spiral, because we've definitely seen a cultural shift in the last couple of years as awareness has grown about the issues. Um, uh, the It's cultural in New Zealand as well. A lot of people are neither here nor there on it, but it's there's this amazing, well-oiled marketing machine which makes people um, want to go to the races even if they're not going to see a horse. So there's this time of year called the Spring Carnival in Australia, where people get dressed up and there's this whole glamorous facade that's thrown behind it, and it's all over the billboards, it's all over the television, and people basically go to have a good time with their friends and get dressed up. And there's this whole fashion side of it, and they have a catwalk and fashion competitions. It's promoted with beautiful women and good looking men drinking champagne and frocking up and all that kind of thing and wearing fancy hats. So it's really embedded itself into Australia's culture in that sense. And often the horse is a kind of secondary, and it's more of a social event. And they've been really effective in doing that. But thankfully, the last few years, and since we've been working since 2008 on exposing the reality behind this sort of glamorous facade, we've seen the numbers drop significantly. So, um, the Spring Carnival, which is the most popular racing event time of year for horse racing in Australia, and the Melbourne Cup Carnival specifically, has dropped by 34% since we've been campaigning in it as far as attendance goes. So that's been fantastic. And Cup Day itself is down about 50% in attendance since 1995. So we've just, and I think after what was exposed last year, and I'm not sure if people in Holland saw it, but there was a huge expose here on the slaughter of ex racehorses, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and some horses that never even make it to the track because they don't show the desired attributes. That was a huge expose that went around the world, and I strongly recommend people watch it if they haven't seen it. It was on ABC's 7:30, and it was called The Final Race. Um, and since that's been exposed, there was just such a huge public outcry last year, and it will be very interesting to see the stats coming out of attendance and things since then, because people just didn't know how bad this industry was. They see a horse running and they think, oh, horses love to run, you
Yeah.
know, don't see the horrors that go on behind the scenes to make those horses run, to get them to that point, and what happens after they've been used up. So, as much as it is a cultural thing that's really ingrained in Australian society and somewhat in New Zealand as well, it's certainly um, I believe, and the numbers are showing on a downturn as far as people going to the track. Unfortunately, betting um, is still, because of online, apps now, smartphones. It's really
Yeah.
easy to gamble now. So the betting dollar in horse racing has has gone up. But having said that, um, all gambling has. It's not just a horse racing thing. So it's normal that horse racing has as well. But the demographic that is gambling on horse racing, the highest age bracket is 650 to 64. The under 25 bracket is the lowest. So we're seeing a cultural shift in the younger generation that's moving away from betting on um, but that's actually racing in the sense of harness racing, flat horse racing, and greyhound racing.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of the large portion of the betting on racing in Australia is the flat horse racing, which is where we focus our energy.
And is it so? Could you explain somehow the life of a horse? Like, at what age are they're from? I think from as they're a baby, they're being trained already.
Yeah, so they're being trained so young. We're breeding about 13,000 foals for the horse racing industry at a moment. At the moment, the flat racing industry in Australia, 13,000 thoroughbreds approximately.
Mm-hmm.
That has dropped. Another encouraging sign is that has dropped from about 19,000 not so long ago. I think that was in about 2006. So we've seen a quite a big decline in the breeding numbers of thoroughbreds. But their life is basically one of isolation and high concentrated, high protein diets, which is terrible for horses who need to graze throughout the day. So a lot of them develop stomach ulcers. I think it's about 90% of horses can develop stomach ulcers. So and obviously horses are sort of these herd animals, so they these lives of isolation where they spend most of their time in stalls. They're let out a few hours a day to train, and then they're put back in a stall. That's not a natural life for a horse by any means. So they develop all sorts of mental behavioral issues, such as wind sucking and stereotypical behaviors. You can see them at the track when you go to the back of the stalls. When they're tied up in the stalls, they're throwing their heads around, they're stamping their feet, they're kicking out. They're highly frustrated. And the downside to that as well is once they are unwanted by the racing industry, they're harder to rehome because they often need rehabilitation. And a lot of people aren't willing to put the time and money into that. But before we get to that, I guess once they're being put on the track as young as 2 years old, so their
Mm-hmm.
bodies, their musculoskeletal systems haven't fully developed. So that's why we believe we're seeing huge injuries on the track. So horses are being killed on the track at very high numbers because they're so-called breaking down, they call it, because their bodies are just suffering these injuries, and they because they're being pushed so hard so
Yeah.
young when they're not ready for it. Not that they ever really are ready for that. But that's once they're 2 years old. they're already there. And then the average racing so-called career of a thoroughbred is 3 years. And our horse lives to, 30 years old. So you've got these horses that are only really on average being used for 3 years. And then what are they going to do for the rest of their life? I mean, it's expensive to look after a horse. So once that's over, if they're lucky enough to survive in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
they might get put into jumps races, which is a whole other issue we can discuss, where horses are forced to jump over obstacles at high speeds in big groups, which is highly dangerous and leads to a lot of deaths as well. So they might get put into jumps races to get the last bit of money out of them once they're not competitively fast enough for the flat races. And then once they're done with them there, if they're lucky enough to survive, they get sent to the sales, or they get directly sent to the slaughterhouses we're seeing now as well, because we monitor the sales, and we expose all these thoroughbreds being sent there and sold off to kill buyers for small amounts of money once they're not wanted. And those kill buyers send them to the knackery or to the slaughterhouse. So that is the lucky few will get, kept by the owners. And the majority, we've found about 10,000 a year, our investigations have shown. So that's the majority of those bred are being sent off to the slaughterhouse, and they're the ones that make it to the track. That's another thing. A lot of these, about one third of foals breds don't show the desired attributes. So approximately one third are vanishing before they even make it to the racetrack.
So if it's so you said it's like 13,000 horses that are being like trained, and then one third doesn't make it even to the races. So a horse can get up to 30 years. You just said so that one third dies before like one, like, or they sent to the slaughterhouse before they're one,
Yeah.
and then the rest, if they're used for racing, they're forced their whole life to race, and once they're done, most of them are also sent to slaughterhouses. So their life is basically 3 to 5 years max,
Hmm.
and just
Yeah, you will see a small amount of horses racing up till over 8 years old, but they're a minority. So the average, some will die on their first race. We saw a horse die last week on the first time she was put on the racetrack, she was dead. So it just depends. So she was 2 years old. Others, the majority of the horses racing, I think, are between 3 and 5 years old. Some that survive long enough, will get to about 8, 9 years old, 10 years old on the track, but that's rare, and
yeah, okay.
those horses are really being pushed.
And
um,
then I'm going to just show a video of like these are a few races after each other. They're from a few years ago, but I'll just so people have an idea of what horse racing actually is. And I think these are of jumping and where the accidents can happen.
mhm.
Um, so these are jumping races.
Yes, yeah. So jumps race is very contentious issue in Australia. It's 19 times more likely, statistically 19 times more dangerous than flat races as far
Yeah,
as
you
the
see
death.
horses falling. Yeah, go
Mm.
on.
So they're forced to jump over these obstacles when they're close together. Um, and some of the races are really grueling. They're really long distance, and they can have, you know, uh, so many jumps that they're supposed to get over. And you'll find by the end, it's so common for by the last couple of jumps, they just can't even raise their body over them. They're just so exhausted, and they just hit the deck, and it's so easy for them, as you can see, to get injured. So jumps races, even within the industry itself, because it makes people turn off horse racing. So even people within the horse racing industry are against jumps races because it makes their industry look so bad. So yeah, it's just and a lot of people don't see this. What they do when they're showing these races live, they will try to cut away as quickly as they can
Yeah,
now, because and what we're also seeing now to try to hide deaths on track is when the horses are injured, if the injury is so bad that they have to, I don't like using the word euthanize because I don't it's killing, it's not euthanizing. They've killed them by injuring them. So instead of killing them on the track, if they can get away with it, they will try to load the horse onto a transport and take them away from the track and kill them later, because then the death doesn't have to get recorded on the stewards' reports. And the stewards' reports are basically a report from every race, what happens, Was a horse killed? Was a horse injured? If you take that horse away from the track, they don't have to report that death um, on the steward, so it goes unnoticed. So even though we track deaths on track, which are approximately 120 a year, the
Mm-hmm.
reality is the deaths on track would be much, much higher because it's so
But
many horses come off the track injured and you never hear from them again.
yeah. And then I got to know about horse racing from a horse last year. That was Rostropovich. And that made kind of the news. He was 4 years old. He suffered a fracture in his pelvis. There was a lot of attention for him. Is there any update on him? Because his owners said they would take really good care of him. But then afterwards, I haven't heard anything from it anymore.
Yeah, so the reports are that he's doing really well. So the industry is saying to us. But what happened was he had a fractured pelvis on Melbourne Cup Day. So Melbourne Cup Day is the biggest race of the year, and Melbourne Cup Day has had 6 deaths in 6 years. So being the biggest race of the year, the media attention on that race is huge, and having a death each year, pretty much, or 6 in 6 years, um, has basically really highlighted the issues within the industry that normally would go unnoticed because it's such a big race. And we've been really instrumental in exposing that and raising that awareness. So the media is finally talking about it. And Rostropovich last year was a real. They were trying so hard to make sure they didn't have a Melbourne Cup death, or it would have been 7 deaths in 7 years. So when he was injured, they pulled out all stops to make sure that he was going to survive and return back to the track and have this great return story, which is what they're working towards. Now, other horses have had pelvis fractures of the pelvis in the past, and they've been killed for that injury. So, but when you've got a horse like him who's earned 1.3 million, I believe, in prize money over the years, and had such a media spotlight on them, they're going to spend the money and do the work. And but if the horse, imagine a horse when you breed a horse into the world solely to make you money, and that horse has maybe won you a few tens of $1,000s, you're not going. The reality is they're not going to spend the huge money they're spending on this
Yeah.
horse to bring them back to a full recovery. So this is really, we're glad that obviously they're doing the work to help this horse make it through and not be killed. But the sad fact is, it's a massive PR thing, and it's because the horse is worth a lot of money.
Yeah, because that's I just asked you, is it a cultural thing? But of course, as in horse racing, there's a lot of money. Like I remember this horse, he made a lot of money, and you always see those, like you said, it's a really PR thing around it because you always see the jockeys like really caressing their head, or like they're always like having these pictures come out as if they like, as if they like these horses like their dog, but basically they're just being treated like cars, actually, like race cars, like not.
Absolutely. For the majority of them, they're disposable objects. They take
Yeah,
no responsibility for them once they're stopped making money for them. So they've been, yeah, very good at this whole. It's like all animal abuse industries, really, but particularly horse racing, because it puts that glamorous facade over the
yeah,
top. So yeah, they're wonderful at marketing. And the amazing thing is that when you've got not-for-profit groups such as ourselves, um, who comparatively, don't have a budget anywhere near as great as they do, are still getting the truth out there. It just shows that the truth is so valuable, and when people see it, it breaks through all of that spin. And it's we're obviously we've got a long way to go still, but the truth is getting out there, and it's fantastic.
yeah. And I think like what you said, like most importantly, these horses are just being born and only used for racing, and their life is basically no fun. They're being made to do something that's not of their own choice, and with any animal abuse, of course. But it's sad if you say that they from 2 years old they start racing, that some even die in the first race, and a lot of them die before they start racing. Has the coronavirus, like in bullfighting, you've seen because of the coronavirus and the pandemic, so many countries went into lockdown, so a lot of bullfighting events couldn't go through, which maybe there's a chance bullfighting will end. Have you seen, because of the virus and because of the pandemic, things happening in Australia? Because everything was in lockdown.
Well, amazingly, even though COVID, was shutting down everything except essential services, horse racing in Australia was allowed to continue. So it was stopped in England, and I believe it was stopped in America as well. But Australia powered on through. Our government allowed it to continue, so we didn't allow crowds to be at the track, but the industry was allowed to keep going, except in one small state in Tasmania where the industry is quite small. So everyone was quite outraged by that, that it was allowed to continue, and the excuse used was, jobs. It employs a lot of people, so it has to go on. But there's a whole lot of other industries that employ a lot of people that had to shut down. So it really was a sign of just how in the pocket our government is of the racing industry, or the racing industry in the pocket of the government. So um, I think because of that, though, we have seen less impact of, more a big um, show of unwanted horses. But
Mm-hmm.
we did see at the sales the lowest prices for horses going. So some X-race horses were being sold for 20, as low as $20. So
Okay.
I think there was a slight impact, but that was possibly more so coming from the small, the kind of the fact that people were still getting horse race horses are always at the sales, but I think
Mm-hmm.
this was showing that people weren't out there looking to spend money on buying a horse because perhaps they were struggling financially because of the pandemic. So
Yeah.
therefore, they were not wanting to go and buy horses at the sales to take home as a pleasure riding horse, for
Yeah, so
example.
then because that's also like in bullfighting you see the same. Like it was the events didn't go through, but then all the bulls didn't live neither. Like they were all sold for meat. So like if they're not used for in the sport, then yeah. So I guess with horses the same. If they're not being sold as a racehorse, then they're sold for meat. So
That's right.
it's a lose for animals in this story.
Exactly. That's right.
Um,
I should have said, if I could, when we spoke about the life of a racehorse, I completely forgot to mention that, outside of the isolation and the training regimes and the high protein diets, they're also using all sorts of instruments of torture on these horses to make them compliant and to force them to run faster. So you're beating them with a whip. They're putting a tongue tie often on their tongue to hold their tongue down. They're using a bit, which is obviously a metal rod, basically shoved in the horse's mouth to control the horse and steer the horse. And then you've got spurs as well. They're still using spurs in horse racing, and they dig them into the horse. And we're seeing that as whips become more controversial, spurs are becoming more popular because they're less obvious to the public that a spur is being used.
what does a spur look like? I don't know what is a
Like a,
spur.
it's a round spike on the back of the shoe that you can dig into the horse
Oh,
when they kick them. Yeah,
yeah.
it's got like little spikes on there. So,
I-
I mean, these are instruments that are, being used on these horses daily to terrify them and force them way beyond their natural, um, natural safe capabilities.
Yeah, so in order to make them run like as fast or to make them jump, that's the same. Like any animal that you train, like an elephant in Thailand, you see the same. They use abusive methods because you need to give them pain. In zoo animals, you need to hurt them for them to do what you want. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They just see the racing or an animal at the zoo, but like in order to make any animal just do something that's not natural to them, you have to hurt them.
That's right. I mean, we even had a case here last year. Was it last year? Early last year, I think, where Darren Weir, who's a top trainer in Australia, um, he was exposed and has been charged he's been suspended from racing for 3 years, I believe, which is outrageous. He should be banned. But he was found with jiggers, which are an electric shock device in his possession, and it was proven that he was using them on the horses he was training. So what a jigger does is they don't use them actually on the day of the race, but they use them in training, and then on race day they replicate the behaviour they do. The jockey will replicate the behaviour they do when they use the jigger. So the
Hmm.
horse thinks the jigger's coming, and they respond to that by pushing, by running faster.
Yeah.
So the mental trauma that comes from that, they're just terrified that they're about to be electrically shocked, and it'll push them harder. And the jockeys, unfortunately, the jockeys haven't been investigated, and everyone knows that when you're using a jigger in training, the jockey must be complicit for that to be effective on race day. So,
Mm-hmm.
Darren Weir has been charged, but none of the jockeys are being investigated at all, and they were obviously complicit in it as well.
The ones who are doing it. Do you see this like with the work you're doing and you're exposing this so people start knowing that it's basically a very cruel sport? Like in bullfighting, it's more obvious because you see the bull dying, but horse racing, with what you've told us, it's not a fun life at all. Basically, it's not like the horse is having fun doing this. Do you see an end coming to this whole sport?
I do. It seems crazy to say that considering how big it is, even though it's dropping here. It's still wagering wise, it's still very lucrative. But I am really confident just with the shift I've seen the last few years and the awareness that's being raised, and even the media is very on side now. Talking about the truth of what's really going on. Um, like you said, people don't see what happens because if a horse dies on track, they'll try to hide it. But we put out a death watch report every year, and we're showing that horses are dropping dead on track, and that horrifies people.
Yeah.
Um, so people are really waking up. I mean, unless a pandemic caused by our exploitation of animals wipes us out first, or climate change, which obviously, if the world continues on as normal, I like to think that we'll see an end of horse racing in my lifetime if the trend goes the way it's been going and the younger generation doesn't get sucked into this industry the way they're trying to. They're spending a lot of money at the moment trying to get the young generation involved. As you might have seen, Taylor Swift was meant to play at the Melbourne Cup. So they're getting young, big name celebrities. They're spending like $1 million on getting an artist to come and play to try to get the younger generation into
Yeah.
horse racing and into gambling. And you know, she cancelled because the backlash was so large, which was so good to see. But yeah, they're pulling out all stops because they know that people are waking up to the cruelty, and if they don't get the younger generation on board, and as the older generations die off, they're in serious trouble.
Yeah. But maybe they like I hope organizations also when they start realizing maybe it has been a cultural thing, but maybe they'll wake up too, and if they have so much money they could find other ways to entertain people without hurting animals in the process.
Well, that's right. I mean, we have an Up to the Cup. I don't know if you've heard of that. So it's our anti-Melbourne Cup party. Now,
Mm-hmm.
when we started that, we were the only people doing that, and there was like 40 of us. And we have a party called Up to the Cup. It's across the road from the racecourse where the Melbourne Cup is held, and
Mm-hmm.
show people that you can have a really great time without engaging in animal abuse of any form. So we have a vegan barbecue, and we have human races where people can get dressed up and go in the race. And that's gotten bigger and bigger every year. So many people coming along, and not just that, but having their own Up to the Cups now. So we register them on our website. People can
Mm-hmm.
register their own party. And that can be whether it's something small at the office, or if they want to have a huge fundraiser, somewhere else, and raise money for animals and horse sanctuaries and whatever it might be. Um, and we had a record number of Up to the Cup events registered last Cup Day.
Oh,
Every
that's
year it's gotten bigger. We have big corporate companies calling us now and saying, because there's a thing called a sweep in Melbourne on the Cup Day. So people, it's kind of tradition in Australia that on Cup Day it's actually a public holiday. It's
mm-hmm.
it's wild, but the officers that are at work in the other states, in our state, it's a public holiday, but they will actually have a sweep at the office, or people will have a sweep at their local parties, and they will bet on the horses. Even people who never bet on horses will just get into it because everyone's doing it. And now the corporate businesses are calling us now and saying, it's really controversial for my workplace to be doing this at the moment. Some of the staff aren't happy that we do it anymore. What do you suggest we do? So, I mean, that's a huge shift as well.
Yeah, and I think like you're saying, like I think when people like you just mentioned, people wear like nice clothes and hats, and if there's like if there's people around, you're in beautiful clothes, you're having good food and alcohol. I think you don't need to have like pain animals in the process. It's
No.
absolutely not necessary. You'll have as good as a time with just your friends.
Yeah, probably more.
Yeah, actually probably more, because you're not participating in something extremely cruel. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the work you do for horse racing, and let's hope in our lifetime that we'll see it or earlier, that it ends.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.